They called her just the help. Then he stood up and said her name. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. The town of Mercy's Bend sat like a dry coin on the prairie, edges worn by wind and sun until its face was nearly smooth. Houses leaned from their porches as if listening to the same long, low conversation the wind carried. A single line of cottonwoods clung to the edge of the creek like a necklace, their leaves whispering in a voice only the land knew. A saloon's sign swung gently, its letters flaking like old paint on a horse's flank. Dust lived in the air here, in the creases of collars, in the knuckles of people who refused help. Even at dawn the dust held on. By the time the lamplight went out of the east, by the time the kettles began to sing on brass stoves, by the time the first coffee cup steamed fog on a morning that smelled of cold iron and old grief, she was already moving. She moved like the town expected her to, quiet, steady, without fuss. She carried plates and hopes with equal care. She folded aprons and days the same way, neatly, as if order could hold a life from falling apart. They called her Nora Lane. Nora by her mother's voice, Lane by the way folks said it when they felt above saying much at all. The saloon belonged to the Whitaker brothers, broad shoulders and broader claims, but Nora kept its heart. The stove that warmed the place and the quiet that stopped men from saying worse things than they already meant. She was not showy. She kept her hair braided at the nape, her hands calloused in the way of someone who washed other people's messes until they smelled faintly of lie and kindness. Her apron had a long stain across the hem from a stew that stewed and fed too many mouths. Her eyes were the color of the creek in late summer, gray-green, and they said more than her mouth ever could. When she laughed, it was a small sound like a bell someone taps in a church when no one is listening. Nora was plain-spoken. She was steady. She was grit-tough in the way people are when there's something to hold on to and no one to lean on. She had come to Mercy's Bend 3 years prior with a trunk that had lost a corner and a pocket still holding a letter she'd read only in the dark. The letter had been folded until the paper weakened. The ink faded where a thumb had pressed too often. It was from a man who didn't keep promises. The letter told her to come to a place called Mercy's Bend, where work was honest and wages were steady. The man never arrived. The trunk waited at the depot for a week until the ticket seller decided he was done being respectful. Whatever Nora had been before, there are always many somethings, was now the apron and the kettle and the small, private grief that lived behind her ribs like a smooth stone. She was also alone, widowed in the eyes of the town sometimes. There were whispers, the sort of low talk that folded around a woman like cold water. Widowed in the way the sheriff tipped his hat and the preacher said a soft word under his breath as if the orbit of sorrow needed blessing. Alone in the way that can be like armor and like a shackle both. Despite that, she kept her head high. She worked. She put out chairs for men who had too many worries to carry and fed throats that had run too dry on regret. She sat at the back of the saloon with a tin cup and watched lives slide by like animals on a long drive. She listened. People did not notice that listening is an act that saves more than dishes. Nora listened like someone was teaching her to remember. There was a preacher's wife in Mercy's Bend, Mrs. Callahan, who kept her gloves on long past Sunday and loved the tilt of patronizing words. She had looked Nora up and down once, then blessed the room for sins she had not seen. "A woman ought to be with a man," she had said, placing emphasis like a ledger on the table. "A woman shouldn't be living by herself in a saloon, Nora. It doesn't look right," the room agreed by leaning in. The Whitaker brothers pretended not to hear, because men who make a living on others' sorrow are careful with their economies. Some laughed, a polite half-sound, because a town's bread needs a crust. Nora only tightened her jaw and handed Mrs. Callahan a pie in which she had tried to hide sweetness. There was a sheriff who liked to keep order and liked more the sound of his own voice than the weight of his badge. Sheriff Devlin had been rounder in his first years, as if fat had been his shield against the world. Now he kept his coat buttoned, his hands in his pockets when he thought no one watched, his expression a ledger kept closed. He mocked Nora when he thought her back was turned. He made a public sport of small cruelties that passed for jokes. "You're a brave soul, Nora," he said once in the saloon, loud enough for all to hear. To put up with the likes of men who wouldn't know good if it bit, and people who liked the weight of their tongues chuckled. Nora's silence soaked him. It was like throwing water on someone who wanted a show. Then he rode into Mercy's Bend like a grim shadow crossing the sun. He came as the town expected of a stranger, dust curling from the hem of his coat, a hat that had seen more than one winter, boots stained with the color of 100 trails. His horse was a wide-mouthed animal with eyes that had known pain. He rode slow because fast brought attention, and because a man who'd lived the world learned to pace his steps like he was saving himself for a far road. Folks stood at windows. They watched the door for novelty, like the world might offer them fresh gossip if they stayed still long enough. The Whitaker brothers watched, too, their bets measured in the furling of napkins. He tied his mare outside the saloon and let the dust sift off his coat as if shedding old regrets. He took off his hat when he stepped in, revealing a forehead like weathered leather and hair the color of river mud. He had a jaw that showed he had once had cause to bite down words that could have cut. There were scars, thin and honest, along his forearms, proof that he had labored or fought. He himself would not be clear which. He carried his hands in his pockets until he needed them. He carried his silence like something valuable. No one spoke his name for a long while. Names are weapons in some towns. They sharpen them like knives, hand them to children. He sat at the bar like he meant to be invisible and like invisibility was a plan. He drank coffee that steam rose from like a small ghost and kept to himself. For a week he sat in the same place, watched the same faces, paid very little mind to the small cruelties that passed for humor. He looked at Nora the way a man looks at a place he's thinking about making a home, with measuring, with a careful touch of longing. His eyes were not the bright, searching kind. They were the kind that had seen much and had learned slow. Nora noticed him between pouring gravy and wiping down the same scarred table. He had an air about him that was neither boast nor placard, only an honesty so bold it did not draw attention. He was careful. He hung his hat by the peg near the door, and his boots sat like two small, quiet claims on floorboards that had heard too much. He asked nothing of her, and that was how he made an entrance that asked to be returned. People named him Rowan Hale because that is what the Whitaker brothers called the man who paid his coffee and kept to his seat. They liked names with weight. He was quick in the mouth only when he had to be. He was quicker with a glance that found the hurt behind a woman's chin, the stubborn set of shoulders that kept on walking. Once, when someone made an unkind remark about Nora's apron being better than her reputation, he stood slowly and said, "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone." The room inhaled like a horse snorting. No one had said such a thing before. Nora's hands stilled. The sheriff stared like someone had thrown a die that didn't belong to him. He did not speak to her for days after that. He watched. Men watched football and dice and shadows. He watched the way Nora moved, how she did not let anyone fill the small gaps she made. He noticed the calluses at the base of her thumb, how her fingers flexed when she thought no one was looking. He watched the way she warmed her cups with cupped hands when there was no need, because the world felt colder to her than to others. He watched her when she straightened stools that were out of line and when she tucked stray hairs behind a worn ear. He watched how she knelt to rescue a sparrow that had flown in and gotten lost, the same way she took the stew pot off the fire when someone's appetite turned sorrowful. He watched her feed those who had no one else. He watched the way she held back the tide of her own grief so it didn't sweep others away. Then came the winter when the creek froze at the edges and Mercy's Bend made plans to be careful. Food stores tightened. Coal ran scarce. Pride, being a more fragile sort, grew thinner in men who had once felt like kings of the road. The Whitaker brothers argued over bills. The preacher prayed louder. The sheriff found new rules to enforce. Nora's work got harder by the hour, and the town's patience amounted to what a horse's shoe makes when it rubs while a man can't afford another. On a night when the wind seemed bent on making old bones break, a wagon pulled in late, its driver hollow-eyed and clapping at his whip like he was pretending to be in control. He told them a story about a freight run gone wrong, about a stolen mule, and about a boy who had been left at the mercy of cold hands and colder boots. The Whitaker brothers looked to Nora because they had trained the town to expect mercy from the person least likely to demand recognition. Nora took the boy in without asking. The rotten boy, thin as a skiff and coughing like an old pump, wrapped himself around a piece of bread as though it might anchor him from the wind. Nora laid a blanket over him, and for a few hours that night the saloon smelled of soup and clean wool and quiet. The sheriff shook his head like it hurt to know such things could happen under his watch. "We can't be feeding every stray," he said, as comfortless as an unused boot. There was a chorus of murmurs. Men who liked the quickness of their judgments and women who were fond of rank. Mrs. Callahan was the loudest. "Whoever he is, we don't want trouble," she said. Folks nodded, and their nods sounded heavy as iron. The boy slept and dreamed badly. Nora sat by him and held a cup of tea in hands that had more warmth than the blanket did. She touched the boy's brow, just once, gently, like testing a chord. The sound of the kettle seemed to fill the room. The cowboy Rowan had watched from a corner. He had watched many nights, but something in the way Nora bent like that made the room thinner. It made his chest do a thing he had not let it do before, which was ache. When the sheriff went to leave, a slight trouble brewed. The sheriff, who held the town's tongue like a talisman, voiced what many had let the world decide for them. "We oughtn't encourage more," he said. "They'll think this place easy pickings." The Whitaker brothers murmured about guests and coin. Everyone felt the cold that comes when a house decides to shut a door on the wind. Nora only tightened the blanket once, smoothed the boy's hair with a finger that smelled faintly of lye, and kept her silence. Rowan walked over and put a tin of beef on the table. "For the boy," he said, and it was easy and plain. There was no flourish. Nora said, "Thank you," with the kind of voice that keeps going even when it wants to crack. He nodded as if that had been the only thing to say. The sheriff said nothing and left, his horse shivering at the hitching post. Days moved into weeks. The boy got steadier in the gut. The town began to share him as they shared a new rumor, the way men will touch a thing because it is new. They watched to see whether the boy belonged to Nora, as if people can assign ownership to another's kindness and then feel secure. Nora's eyes kept to his small shoulders, to a chest that filled with air the way a bellows learns to function again. Then trouble came with a man who'd once had a taste for other people's sorrow. He was a livestock trader from 2 towns over, a man who measured gold by the way he could consume a life. He rode into Mercy's Bend as coaches roll toward an easy mark. He bought the Whitaker brothers' patience with coin, with easy talk about business and clearing debts. They liked the sound of his money. It made their walls stand up straighter. He tipped his hat at Nora like she was a fixture with no father, no right to claim self. He slipped a bottle across the bar and asked for a favor in the kind of voice that finds leverage where none seems readily available. "One of your easy sorts," he said of Nora, smiling as if he were naming a thing he owned. "She seems soft." Mrs. Callahan laughed too loudly. "Softness gets you beaten in winter," she declared. All around, people nodded. They liked to fashion justice out of others' costs. They liked to feel righteous while they cast shadows. Nora continued. She moved between them, letting plates and silence do her work. She answered the town's small cruelties with a skill that came from refraining. It is a particular kind of mastery to preserve oneself through being stepped on, to maintain the inner fire while the weather crushes its smoke. Nora did this with the sort of patience that is learned, like knotted stitches learned by a trembling hand. One night the trader decided to find entertainment in cruelty. He led one of the Whitaker brothers, already drunk on hubris, to speak more clearly than he ought. He wanted Nora to clean a mess she did not make. A man's mistake, a game gone sour. The proprietor accused the boy of stealing a satchel with pay inside. "You let him sleep in your place," the Whitaker snorted, aiming a grin full of small teeth at Nora. "See what comes of trusting the likes of them." The town circled like hyenas. The sheriff cleared his throat and asked for order. Nora looked at the boy. He was small, his eyes wide and scared like a baby colt. He shook his head hard enough to make the frayed blanket whisper. Nora's apron stiffened with a hand that had not been raised in her defense before. She was quiet, but there was something like steel under her ribs when she straightened her back. She could have argued. She chose instead to move. She fetched the satchel from beneath the bar where the Whitaker brother had hidden it to save his own hide. She opened it slowly. Inside were letters, more letters, folded in a corner like a family of moths. There was no money. The trader's face tightened. The Whitaker brother muttered. "Wouldn't you be looking at that?" Someone said with a sound that was almost a laugh. "A woman keeps other people's secrets and pays the price." Nora lifted the satchel, placed it on the bar. She said to the crowd in the low voice she saved for the things that mattered. He didn't take it. Her eyes scanned the room and landed on the trader, and for a moment a hush fell like dust from a ceiling. Her voice was not loud. It was clear the way a rifle is clear, direct, unadorned.
"No flourished, no pasturing."
She did not flinch when the trader moved like a viper. "You got no proof," he snapped. He wanted to make law with intimidation. Mercy's Bend had once been an honest place, but then honesty moved away and left a few people behind who liked the shape of accusation. Rowan stood. He walked to the trader with the sound of boots like a metronome. No one knew if he would strike. He did not. He said a thing so simple that it felt like a blade cutting bad bread. "You'll tell him to leave." His voice was low, and when he said Nora's name, it sat in the room like a salve. "And you'll pay him for his trouble while you're at it." The trader laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "You don't tell me what to do, son." Rowan's face changed then. It was like seeing a storm stack itself at the horizon. He did not shout. He moved with the consideration of a man who had been through a fight and come out holding the things he loved. He stepped in between the trader and Nora. The room felt as if it might break. "You know what I want," he said. "I don't want trouble, but I don't like the way you look at her." His words were slow and deliberate. They landed like a man placing bricks. "We all got to live here. You go on now," he pointed, and the trader walked, because sometimes a look contains more law than a sheriff's badge. The man left. The Whitaker brothers looked like the ground had fallen from beneath their joke. After he left, the room recovered its breath in the way of people who have been spared some immediate catastrophe. Nora kept to her business as if that was the only language she owned. When she moved, Rowan noticed the slightest tremor in her hands, the kind of tremor that carries a great deal of saved grief. In the days that followed, the town watched them together as you watch two birds on a wire, one expecting either to fly or plummet. The sheriff frowned like a man whose ledger had been adjusted without his consent. Mrs. Callahan filled pews with calls for moral order. But Nora carried on. Life is a stubborn thing. She took plates to men who asked, patched tears in coats and in souls the best she could. She listened. She burned her grief quietly until it became something that only warmed her at night. Rowan kept his distance sometimes. He kept his attention other times. He left small signs of regard, an extra sack of flour by the kitchen door, a rope mended and hung in plain view, a single horse blanket left near the stove when he thought that the cold might claim what warmth it could. He would put wood on the fire and then step outside to let his breath make patterns in the air. Nora noticed these small mercies and did not know what to call them. She had been given gifts before. They had been taken back. This felt like seeds being scattered on soil. Then came the night that everyone thought would break her. It was a fair-like evening when the world was crowded and loud and the whiskey felt as if it could cover sorrow for the night. The Whitaker brothers had a new idea for profit, an exhibition of sorts, a display of the town's best and worst. Men placed bets on the smallest things and called it sport. Mrs. Callahan had a front-row seat for moralizing. The trader returned because he could not leave a seed unplanted. The sheriff was fatter with his newly assumed importance. They decided to hold a contest of feats. Spurs, accuracy, who could tell the meanest truth. The sort of entertainment that turns truth to spectacle. The room was full and warmth and noise. Nora moved through the crowd like a small moon slipping through clouds. She stacked dishes, refilled cups. The boy sat near the stove, his chin tucked into a blanket. Someone, somewhere, threw a jest that clipped and stuck. "The help will sing us a tune," someone suggested. A man fond of seeing women perform. Laughter like a pack of coyotes responded. The traitor grinned wide, a rodent stripped of shame. Sing? Someone else chuckled. She might teach children to be humble. Words like stones flew into Nora. She kept on. She wiped plates. She carried on as if each insult were only the work of a moment. But the crowd grew hungry for show. They do that. People who have let compassion turn bloodless become hungry for spectacle because it numbs their awareness. Somebody stood and called out, half joking, half cruel. If Nora is so kind, let's see her kindness now. Bring out the boy who stole. The room roared like a beast woken at wrong hour. Nora froze because the world sometimes stops you in a way that makes your heart leap. She looked toward the boy, whose eyes were large and holding back a fear he did not have words for. Nora moved like a woman aware of the way the world will push a person against a cliff to see if they'll climb. She took the boy by the hand. There was a swelling in her chest that felt like a bell trying to ring. She carried him toward the center of the floor where the town had put its elbows like a jury. When Mrs. Callahan sneered in front of the entire room, calling Nora out as a woman who had no measure and no respect, the sheriff smirked and took his cue. "Stand him up," he said, and the room hummed with cruel anticipation. The Whitaker brothers were ready, tools of the trade sharpened. The traitor leaned forward, eyes hungry to watch another be humiliated. Nora did not speak loudly. Her voice was the way a night wind presses through shutters, quiet but intent. "He didn't take anything," she said. The room fell like a curtain. "You gonna stand there for him?" the sheriff demanded. "You gonna make us all fools?" She looked at the sheriff in a way he had not been looked at before, as if she saw the ledger and the man behind it and the thinness he kept. Her fingers closed on the boy's small shoulder. "I'm not asking for anything for myself," she said. Her voice was steady, a bell that would not break. Then the traitor decided to escalate in a way that shows the measure of a man's contempt. He stepped forward, palms open, as if to display the worst of his nature. "We'll not have scroungers here," he declared. "We make it clear. We chase 'em out. Or we teach 'em the sorts of lessons that stick." Rowan's jaw tightened. The room tuned itself like an instrument and found the wrong note. The traitor advanced, hands finding the boy's blanket. "He'll not take again," he said. "We'll show mercy for the sake of example." If the town had been a living thing, it would have held its breath. They watched Nora as they watch flames when they want to know whether to run. She stood small and thin and steady, her hand over the boy's shoulder like a lighthouse. She said nothing more. The traitor's hand moved to the blanket like a predator. Rowan moved then, as if compelled by something inside him that recognized honest courage and refused to watch its punishment. He stepped between the traitor and the boy, his hand a low thing near his holster, not a threat so much as a promise. "You leave him," he said. "You leave the lot of them." The traitor laughed, which was a mistake in a room where men were watching the edges of violence like teenagers at a bonfire. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" he sneered. Rowan looked out across the room at the faces gathered like an audience, at Nora who had been dismissed like old cloth, at the boy whose small mouth tried to form safety. He felt something, call it a long-held regret or a promise he had once made to himself, to not let a wrong stand in front of someone who could not fight back. He had once killed in the right sort of wrong, but he had been trying to make pay for that cost for years. This was part of that reckoning. He did not draw his gun. He used his voice low and steady. "Get out," he said. It was not bravado. It was a small sound of a man placing his weight somewhere that was not his past. The traitor, all teeth and greed, tried to laugh it down, but the sheriff's face had gone pale as new paper, and there were looks directed at him now. Looks that said a town that tolerates cruelty is no town at all. The traitor stood his ground only long enough for Rowan's patience to harden. Then someone pushed him, one of the Whitaker brothers who was less thoughtful than bold, and the traitor stumbled backward. A chair scraped. For a crazy moment the room sensed the thrill of a brawl, and the town loved it in the way people love calamity because calamity makes them feel alive. Then a hand caught the traitor and shoved him toward the door. By the time the traitor hit the hitching post, He was a man who had decided he did not like the taste of Mercy's Ben's law. But that did not end the humiliation. Mrs. Callahan, feeling slighted by a world that had not collapsed into her script, decided to press the door in a way that might crack Nora. She turned her face toward the boy like a gavel. "If you will keep such things," she said to the room, loud enough that it might become scripture, "then you must keep order. A woman who keeps astray becomes soft. A town like ours will not stand soft." The room took that line and ran with it. A man stood and said, a little too loudly, "She ought to be taught her place." Nora's face did something then that unsettled people who preferred clarity to complex truths. It flushed. Not the bright red of rage, but a fullness that felt like pain trying to come through a throat. She could have left. She could have gone to the door and become a rumor. Instead, she did the thing she always did. She acted. She looked the crowd in the face with the kind of steady gaze that tells a story of small survivals. "I have shelter," she said. "I have bread. I have hands to mend what gets broken. I don't ask for praise for it. But if there's one thing I cannot abide, it's that a man who is hungry be told he is nothing because he has no coin." Women who had once been kinder to Mrs. Callahan shifted in their chairs. They had felt the ease of placing blame, and now they felt the tug of a conscience determined to speak. For a moment, there was the possibility that something smaller than a town might change. A silence built like a cathedral. The sheriff, who had built his sense of self on being loud enough to be feared, felt the eyes of his community on him. He might have done what was right. He might have stood for Nora. Instead, he kept his hands in his pockets and let the moment pass as if it were only another feather in a hat. Rowan saw the way the sheriff hesitated and felt a bitterness like cold water. He could not predict heroics in a man who had none, and so he made his own. He stepped forward, not with a gun, but with a manner that carried a quiet authority. He put a hand on Nora's shoulder and helped the boy up into her arms. The crowd could not quite tell whether it was a movie or a small miracle. "Let him be," Rowan said. "You can go on and judge a woman who does right, or you can learn what right looks like." There was no sermon in his voice, only the straightforwardness that sometimes stands for morality. He was not gentler in his manner than was required. He was gentler in the respect he gave a thing worth protecting. Nora, surprised, allowed herself to look at him. Her eyes, for the briefest of seconds, turned to the man with the hat that had seen miles. There was something like a recognition between them, two people who had been through the churn of living and had come out the other side with less and more depending on the day. She lowered her voice and said, "Thank you, it was not much. But in Mercy's Bend it was enough to put a crack in the brickwork." After the room emptied, after the trader's horse had been led away and the Whitaker brothers had lit their cigars and stood like men who are trying to piece together a story that will make them look smart, Nora sat by the stove and held the boy, who finally drifted to sleep with a breath that sounded like relief. Rowan lingered near the door until the lamplight gave him more shadow than he wanted. He told Nora nothing, but he had done enough to say that some things had ended as much as they had begun. What followed was a slow thaw in the town's heart. It was not sudden. Mercy's Bend did not change like a river changing course with a storm. The change was the kind that makes small pathways take root. Folks who had once liked to watch people falter found themselves less certain of their appetite for cruelty. Some of them softened. Others merely moved on to find another source of amusement. But the seed had been planted. Rowan and Nora spoke in fits and starts. They sat by the stove and said the kinds of small things that stitch a life together. Where the next sack of flour might come from, whether the boy should be apprenticed to someone who would teach him a trade, the best way to stitch a boot sole without wearing out your back. The boy, named Amos by a woman with more certainty than several men, began to learn the taste of bread that was not always fear. He learned to tie knots under Nora's patient tutelage. He learned to keep his eyes soft when the world got harsh. Rowan watched. He did not intrude, though sometimes his watchfulness felt like a tide pulling something ashore. He repaired a fence one afternoon and left his tools by the kitchen door. The Whitaker brothers grumbled at his meddling because a man who had a quiet way of being right was a nuisance to those who lived by boasting. Nora watched him from the doorway and realized that the heat in the stove was no longer the only thing that warmed her. She felt something like a small flame begin to live beneath her sternum. A dangerous, hopeful thing. He was a man with a buried past, of course. Everyone has a past. A past is how people are weighed. Rowan had a past that hung about him like a thin coat. Inside, his hands bore the marks of work and of things that the law might have frowned on once. His eyes told stories he refused to narrate aloud. He had been a man who had done wrong, perhaps, and had come seeking a town upon which to try honesty. He kept to himself, but there was a steady rhythm to his life. Watch, speak when necessary, do small acts of decency and move on. He had learned the harshness of being judged by the company of men he used to be, and so he kept his identity folded like old maps, only revealing a place to stand when the road ran out. Nora learned of a bracelet he carried. A thin loop of silver with a mark on its underside that bore the initial R. She found it once when he left the kitchen door open in a hurry. He had been at the barn fixing a stall door. Nora tucked it into her apron and returned it later with a quiet look that asked nothing. He took it back like a man who had been caught with a private thing on display. "It means nothing," he said one night, and though he meant to close the conversation, there was an honesty in the phrase that could not quite hide his heart. Nora did not pile on. She kept an ear for the things that mattered. How his hand tightened when he spoke of dark nights, the way he warmed the cup before he drank. She began to see the past not as a sentence but as dirt that could be turned and planted anew. Their relationship did not blaze. It settled like a house with good foundations, silent walls that learned to lean on each other. They shared small kindnesses the way people share a road, without fuss, with a gratitude that has the shape of prayer. Rowan started leaving a rope on the back peg, a simple length of twine he had braided himself, polished to softness by use. He left it with things Nora might need. A new broom, a patch for Amos, a sack of rice. It was his way of threading a life toward something. Nora kept it tied in her own way, up high where the light could find it. She called it the rope of attention, the rope that kept the kettle from falling. But the town liked to talk, and tongues find ways to twist what is generous into rumors of ownership. "One day," someone said, "she'll be his woman. He's put a rope on the peg for her." They said it with that strange mixture of possessiveness and relief that people feel when they can imagine the world becoming simpler. Nora heard it and felt something like a bruise. A part of her wanted to deny the rope, the sentiment, the very idea that kindness must lead to belonging. She had been burned by promises before. She had lived many seasons in which the fire went out cold. But she didn't say so, because saying so would be to reveal the marrow of her unease. Instead, she kept her quiet. She kept making stew. Rowan, for his part, felt something he had been running from, the want of closeness. It was terrifying. He had been taught by men who think violence is currency that closeness is weakness. He had learned too by being around Nora that it was also a way to measure worth. He had seen other men who were empty because they had everything and never gave away a thing that mattered. Norris, his old partner in times when he had not been trying to do better, had said of kindness, "It's a mark of fools," but Rowan had learned that fools sometimes are the only sensible people left. One late afternoon, when the wind was gentler and the sunlight turned the saloon windows to molten honey, Nora found that the town had stopped noticing her, which is to say, they had stopped giving their judgments so much work. The boy had been given a place on a farm out of town where he might learn carpentry. Amos left with a grin and with Nora's blessing. She watched him go with more loneliness than she expected. She had grown used to being needed. It is both a pleasant and dangerous addiction. Rowan was in the doorway, a shadow against the light. He came and stood near Nora, his coat folded to look like humility. She didn't look up at first. She was used to him watching. "You look like you could use a hand," he said, as if offering ordinary assistance might be the highest form of care. She smiled then, small and cautious. "I could," she said. "These floors don't buff themselves." He held out a hand, not grandly but as a natural thing. She placed her palm in his, and for the first time there was an ease between them that did not feel like an arrangement of utility. Felt like a sharing of heat. They began to admit small things between them. A memory, a wound, a grin. Nora told him of a letter she kept under the floorboard of her trunk. One she had never burned because the paper still smelled of hope. Rowan told her, reluctantly, of runs and roads and a life that had once been ugly with choices he'd not be proud of. He said, not too loudly, that he had killed a man once. He said it because there are confessions that need to be out in the open for the air to find them. Nora listened without judgment because judgment is a luxury when you have warmed too many hands on a cold night. Her silence wrapped around the confession like a kind hand that knows the shape of things. Over time, Mercy's Bend saw them move together like two birds on a telephone wire that had learned to balance. They did not hurry into a life. That would have been the town's wish, to have something happen and then applaud it in a weekend. Their courtship was the slow thing, stitched in the seams of shared work and wordless support. They did not kiss with the urgent theatrics of new lovers. They touched like people who are threading a rope. The town watched and liked to imagine their own futures in the shape of the couple's slow happiness. But the past has a way of pushing its head up from the soil when you think you have put it to rest. One morning, as the sun put a thin gold edge on the prairie, a rider from Rowan's past appeared in town. He came with the same careful boot that men of consequence always do, and the town sensed the tension like an animal sniffing smoke. He stopped at the saloon door and let his eyes sweep about like a man who remembers the faces of those he owes. Rowan recognized him immediately. There was an instant where a wound opened inside him and you could see the shape of it plain. This man knew the things that were not said. He was not the sort of person to reconcile. He came to collect. People in small towns attract their pasts like metal draws lightning. Rowan's past had been one of questionable alliances and hasty choices, and one of those choices had left people who wanted restitution. The man, whose name was Breck, loose in pronunciation like broken glass, ordered a whiskey and sat apparently casual. His eyes went to Rowan like a dog's eyes go to a bone. He began to say things about debts and owing and a past that must be paid. The saloon felt a cold front roll through. Nora, who was at the stove, felt it too, like a fret in the kettle. Her hands trembled like someone hearing a sob through a wall. Breck was not gentle. He had teeth like a trap. He spoke in ways that made the sheriff light up with interest because a sheriff likes to see someone prove what he says is law. Breck talked about an old job, about loot that had been stashed and never accounted for. He talked of men Rowan had known who wanted their piece of the story. He sat back and let tension be another drink in the room. When finally he named Rowan and said that the man owed him something, money, life, allegiance, the town turned its head like a chorus. Rowan's jaw tightened. There was a look that crossed his face that Nora saw, and it made a small bell go off inside her. Either he would run or he would stand and fight. She did not know which to prefer. Both frightened her. Both also promised truth. Rowan confronted him outside in the cold morning light where breath made small clouds and where the prairie didn't care about men's business. He told Breck that he had paid debts in his own way, that he did not want trouble for the town, and that he had no intention of letting the sort of past that was not his to dictate the lives of those who had done right. Breck laughed like a hungry animal and said the town's particular kindness can be bought away if a man holds a grudge long enough. The breaths they made fogged the space between them. When it seemed Breck would press further, Rowan's voice dropped and he said, "You best move on." They faced each other. The air held. Breck, being a man of skill and cold ferocity, decided to test Rowan. He said that he would not leave until Rowan had given him what was owed, meaning allegiance, meaning a return to the old ways. Rowan's back straightened. He had come to Mercy's Bend to be done with that life. He would not placate a man who trafficked in other people's misery. He said he would not. Breck made a threat, one that was not veiled. He whispered of old partners who might not be kind to a man who refused them. The world is full of small arrangements that people keep because they can't imagine another way to be with themselves. Rowan was repelled by the man's arrogance and repulsed by the comfortable cruelty in his voice. He refused. Word traveled like gossip because it is much easier to make a storm than to carry a quiet presence. The town stirred. People who had been kind to Nora felt a strange solidarity in being near someone who defied a bully. Those who had thrived on the trader's coin shied away. The tension built like a storm front. Breck left town to fetch fellows whose names would not fit well in polite company. He promised a reckoning. Rowan tightened his jaw and resumed his watch, as if he had become a gatekeeper for the town he had been welcomed into only recently. He tried to be light in front of Nora because he did not want his past to be her burden. But there are certain wounds you cannot hide from someone who feeds you and watches you and who has come to mean soft night. As night came, the sound of hooves became an ominous beat. Breck returned with men behind him, and the town felt like someone had lit a match and then 100 matches, each worry igniting another. They came to the saloon first, wanting to remind the town of old debts, of old arrangements. They were not kindly men. They smelled of rough leather and older grievances. The Whitaker brothers were in the saloon doing what they always did, sizing up opportunities. The sheriff found his voice again because a threat to the town meant he had purpose. Mrs. Callahan clutched her gloves and exhorted the men to be brave. It was chaos built with apathy. Breck demanded Rowan come out. He called the man's name with venom, as if naming was to mark. Rowan stepped outside, his shadow long in the lamplight. Breck's men surrounded him, and things happened quickly. Too quickly for a town that had not seen such violence in seasons. Men urinated the truth in their pants, both in fear and small joy. Breck wanted Rowan to kneel to take a position of shame. He wanted the town to witness the subjugation of a man who had once been part of his circle. He wanted to remind the town that Rowan had no right to the peace he had been offered. Rowan refused to kneel. For the first time since he had come to Mercy's Bend, he drew his gun. It was not for the show of it. It was a necessary thing, pulled from the secret drawer of a life better left closed. It rattled like an old bell. Nora watched from the doorway, and that night a cold sank into her bones because she did not want a life that had become soft to be broken by a past that refused to die. Shots rang like a betrayal. The town held its breath and then let it go in a rush. People ran and then found reasons not to run because the idea of a life torn was too heavy to bear. Roman fell. Men screamed. Nora ducked and covered Amos' shoulders when he flinched. She felt the shot in a way that was not just sound but a punctuation in the ledger of the town. She wanted to run and stop the madness and for once be the woman who did something more than serve stew. Rowan staggered, but he did not go down. He faced Breck. Their fight was not fair in any sense other than the human sense. It was a fight in which both men sought to lay truth bare. When finally the dust settled and the men lay on the ground in a heap of cursing and regret, Breck was taken by the sheriff into the cool of new law. People stood in doorways and watched the silent consequences of violence that had been invited back into a town that had almost decided to be different. After the fight, Mercy's Bend had a new sorting line. People who had been cruel felt the weight of that night like a ledger being balanced. Nora sat by the stove, hands white from gripping the cup too tightly. Rowan limped to the door. For the first time in a long while, he looked at Nora not as someone to rescue but as someone who had rescued him more times than she had any reason to. They moved toward one another slowly because the town could not understand the pace of two people mending. Their closeness was not loud. It was not meant for the eyes of others. It was the kind of hush that a person keeps for their own soul, a small promise that has no band to sign it. Rowan took her hand and placed the simple rope he had braided into her palm. No words were necessary. He had promised her a rope before in a different context. He had meant safety then. Now the rope meant something else. He drew her into his arms like a man learning the shape of another's grief. Her cheek found his chest and she hesitated, because touch can be a scandal and a cure. They held each other like a confession in the dark. Time does what it must. Seasons roll as if unbothered by the small dramas of men. Spring came and Mercy's Bend unfurled its pockets of green. Nora kept working. Rowan stayed. They made a home in the way two people build a fence, one post at a time with patience and nails. The town's gossip stilled because it had run out of momentum. The Whitaker brothers found new employment that required less cruelty. The sheriff reconciled himself to being less of an overseer of petty cruelties and more of someone who kept things. Mrs. Callahan's tongue was not silent. She found other things to fix on because moral certainty must always go somewhere. Nora and Rowan did not marry in any grand moralizing ceremony. They made a day where they agreed, in a small gathering, to begin the life of togetherness. Amos was there, no longer a hollow boy but a student of carpentry with nails and a trade. The Whitaker brothers, at a safe arm's length, brought a pie. The sheriff offered the kind of blessing that sounded like an apology. The town watched, and some rooted for them in the way people root for a horse at the end of a long race. They had been through storms, and now they were planning for the future. They built a home with hands that remembered more than they admitted. They hung that rope, Rowan's rope, on the peg by the kitchen door because it had become more than a tool. They used it as a measure of the life they were building. Not the rope of possession, as the town had once said, but the rope of connection. It was nothing dramatic. It was the small thing that tied kettles to hooks and hands to hands. Sometimes at night they would sit by the stove, his arms around her, and she would lay her head on his chest and listen to his slow breathing. Sometimes they would lie awake and watch the stars and say very soft words about the years they had lost. One summer night, when the town was draped in lamplight and cicadas sang a song like a long memory, Nora walked the length of their porch and stood under the quietly pulsing sky. She thought of the letter folded under her trunk, of the man who had asked her to come to Mercy's Bend and never arrived. She thought of the cherishing of small mercies and the barter of fear and how life had twisted itself into new shapes. She returned to the porch to find Rowan leaning on the rail, his hat in hand. He had the look of a man who had been reborn quietly, like someone who had learned to walk a new road after so many wrong turns. He came close and took her hand, the same way he had the first time he offered to help with the floors. He wrapped the rope, soft and worn, around his own fingers and held her hand like he was binding two things with a promise. "The only rope I want is the one tied to your heart," he said, and it was the kind of line that people in other towns might call grand. But in Mercy's Bend it felt as natural as the first fire in the stove. She laughed softly, a sound like a small bell with the liberty of being unafraid to be heard. "I don't need ropes to hold me down," she said, teasing and steady. "But I'll keep the one you offer if it's made of honest words." Her voice was low and steady, like a vow. He pulled her into his arms and they stayed there, held in a silence that was full of everything they could not yet say aloud. The town beyond their porch went on with its privacy and its second-guessing. But that night they could not touch the small, tender thing the couple had made. A life stitched from little mercies. Months passed. The stove kept humming, the kettle hissing. The lamplight grew warm and familiar. Nora and Rowan tended the town in their own way, with quiet generosity that could not be insured. They helped people not because they thought them owed, but because they had been given a second chance at decency and wanted to share it. The town warmed to that ease like a child learning to trust hands that won't let go. The sheriff softened. Mrs. Callahan's sermons grew less venomous and more a mixture of admonition and faint respect. The Whitaker brothers found new ways to keep money that did not involve breaking the knees of their neighbors. Rowan had days where his past would press against him, turning his throat into a desert. On those nights he would go to the edge of the town and ride his mare along the creek. Nora would watch him leave like a woman who knows the value of solitude. She would wipe the cups and set the chairs and call out nothing because some things have to be navigated alone. In the morning he would return with the smell of rain on him when it had not even rained. He would bring a small gift, a string of dried beans, a fresh spool of thread for Amos. Some would he had carved with his own hand, and the town would smile because they liked to have simple tokens that held no weight. And sometimes when they were together in the small hours, Nora would talk and he would listen. She would tell him the things she had once told the letter folded under her trunk. Hopes that were small and honest, regrets that had been kept for too long. She said the names of people who had wronged her like a prayer for the forgiving. He listened like a man who learned that listening is a way of saving people, who saved his own salvation by lending an ear. Their life was not a perfect tale. They had arguments that tasted of old fears. Rowan would sometimes be distant, and Nora, who had learned to see neglect before it grew, would sometimes withdraw. There were nights when she thought of leaving. But then Amos would come by with a pie he'd attempted to make, and his grin would be large enough to repair small cracks. The town would call on them for small mercies, and they would answer. They would argue in quiet ways. One of them would refuse to meet the other's eyes at breakfast, and the day would pass with a bite left untouched. Then, in the evening, one of them would apologize with a soft touch, and they would return to something that felt bigger than themselves. Years slid by, and with them came the small joys that make a life. Nora taught Amos enough about seam and stove that he could set a table and mend a shirt without calling it a miracle. He married in a small church with quiet vows and promised to keep the honesty he'd learned. The Whitaker brothers retired to a life of less cruelty and more business sense. The sheriff prided himself on having handled his duties. Mrs. Callahan at last learned that kindness could be a form of power. Rowan aged in the way men with hard pasts do. There was a gentleness in his face that had replaced old iron. He and Nora reached a point where they could finish each other's small sentences. They held hands at the window and watched storms pass. They had a child. No, not a child of their own, they decided one morning while they were making bread, but a child in the town. They became the people on whom others relied, which is the highest sort of responsibility. One evening, when the world seemed to have made peace with the small town, a stranger came who had a way of asking about things that made eyes narrow. He was a writer of sorts, a man who collected stories like other men collect debts. He sat in the saloon and watched Nora and Rowan with curious eyes. He asked questions in a soft voice about how a woman who had been called just the help came to be someone's wife in a town that once believed in hard measures. Nora, who had been hardened by slights, softened when he used careful words. She told him the bare bones of a life that had been her own. A letter that never mattered, a town that taught her what mattered, a man who had once been an outlaw and chose differently. The stranger took notes. He left with a tip and a polite thanks. Months later, a pamphlet found its way into the town. It was a small folded piece of paper with a line printed on it. If you saw yourself in her, remember, some roots grow in silence. People read it and nodded because they liked to think they understood the lesson. They were right in some ways, wrong in others. Mercy's Bend was a town of small salvations, and the pamphlet reminded them of a truth they had almost all practiced but seldom named. Nora and Rowan kept to their home by the creek. They tended to the stove and the garden. They walked at dusk and traded small confidences. Rowan still had in his pocket a slip of paper, his own confession, that no one ever read. Nora had the letter under the trunk board that she finally burned one night because the paper had done what it needed to do. Remind her that she had chosen. The fire chewed the letter into warm ash that smelled faintly of a life left to the new. There were small ceremonies of their own. They hung a bell by the porch that they rang when dinner was ready. The sound stitched the day closed like a quilt. They invited neighbors for pie and mended fences for those who could not. They became the people who could be trusted with small fortunes. Secret illnesses, lost animals, last words. Rowan never said many words about the rope beyond that one evening when he'd pulled Nora into his arms and said the most tender thing he had. He did not need to elaborate. She had known for a long time that the only rope she wanted was not a tether. It was the thing that ties two people when they move forward together. It was a rope of promise, of attention, of the willingness to be seen unfavorably and forgiven. Mercy's Bend did not become a perfect place. Perfection is a fiction newspapers write. But the town learned to shield its young from the things it had once inflicted on the weak. If a man came who thought the world was his for the taking, the town now found itself offering somebody who would remind him that things had changed. They had learned to speak Nora's name with a respect that roared away old cruelties. One autumn, when the days thinned and the light went gold early, Nora sat on the porch with her hands in a knitting basket. Rowan came out from the barn with a rope in his hand, new, thick, braided with care, and laid it beside the old one on the peg. He sat down and folded his hands over the short strings. "We did a good thing here," he said. She looked at him and smiled, the kind of smile that holds 1,000 small reasons. "We did," she agreed. "We did it because we were stubborn and kind." They sat like that for a long while, watching the creek reflect the sky. The town hummed around them, not loud enough to pierce the quiet. Nora tightened a stitch and then another. Rowan reached for her hand. They married their days into one life that neither of them had alone. As the years rolled until their hair grayed and they had more stories than time, they became legend. Small and honest, a two-room house with a garden where someone always kept a spare pot on the stove. Children would come by and ask if they could hear about the day the town stood up. Nora would laugh and tell them about the sound of a kettle boiling and the way a small kindness can take root if someone else tends it. Rowan would tell them to mind their ropes and keep their promises. On the last night when the porch light burned and the kettle hissed and the town lay in its usual softness, Nora stood with Rowan by the rail. The air smelled of clean wool and the faint perfume of onions roasting. The stars were sharp enough to prick. They had been together long enough to have learned how important the small things were. The kindling, the bread, the knowing which neighbor needed a hand before they asked. Rowan gazed at Nora with the kind of affection that can only be earned in the act of keeping someone. He took the rope from its peg and placed it in her palm. For a moment they were like two people who remembered all the wrongs and then simply looked ahead. He did not say much. That had never been his style. Instead, he pulled her close and said one last thing, the one that made a hush fall around them like a benediction. "The only rope I want is the one tied to your heart," he said again, quiet this time, as if to seal something that needed sealing. Nora looked up, and her eyes shone. Gray-green, honest, the color of later summers. She kissed him softly and then rested her forehead against his chest and listened to the slow, steady beat of a man who had been brave enough to change. She thought about the boy who had once been a cold shadow in a blanket and who had become a good carpenter. She thought of the traders and the sheriff and the trader who had come and gone, the town that had learned to be better. Nora thought of silence and the ways it had saved and revealed. She thought of the rope and how it had once been a symbol of being tied down, but had become a symbol of being tied to something honest. She breathed a small breath and let it go. If her story hit you hard, remember the ones who stay quiet. There are so many Nora Lanes in the world. Faces kept to corners. Hands that keep serving despite the world being unkind. Some of them will not find a Rowan, but all of them deserve a rope of their own. Whether it's a friendship, an admission, a town that stands up against cruelty. It is in the small mercies we give that the big ones grow. She gave everything without asking. And finally someone gave back. And that's how a whisper changed a town.